where did you meet? Is that where you met?
VS? I met him in and around London literary circles, and sometimes we shared platforms. And then I interviewed him for the BBC, for BBC Two when his book came out. In the book review program, they wanted me to talk to him about A Million Mutinies Now, and he was quite wary of what I would ask him and how he would come across and so forth. In fact, he tried to cancel the interview once, before it happened. And then the producers threatened him and said, well, if you cancel the interview, we'll just give Mr. Dhondy 30 minutes to speak and say what he likes about you. And he said, no, then I will be interviewed. So he came around to being interviewed. Later on, we made good friends because he and his wife, his new wife, Nadira, used to read my columns in India and had read some of my books. And when she got married and came to Britain in 96, 97, she insisted on having lunch with me. And I can imagine Vidya must have said, you want to have lunch with that scoundrel? And she said yes. And the agent, Gillen Aitken, phoned me up and said, Vidya wants to have lunch with you. And I said, that's not... it's not something I'd expect because he doesn't particularly like me. And he said, no, all that's changed. Nadira wants to meet you. So I went to Bibendum for a lunch with them. And he was very stern at first. But then I made him laugh by telling him a story about, they asked me what I was doing. And I said, I've just been to Jamaica. And in Jamaica, we had a crew shooting a documentary on Jamaica ER, which means the emergency room in the hospital. And as the crew went in one morning through the yard, there was a tall black man sitting, security guard, at the gate. And he said, are you the television crew? So we said, yes. And he said, before you go in, you've got to listen to me. We said, to what? And he said, well, I'm the Nat King Cole of Jamaica. And he began to sing, Mona Lisa, Mona Lisa. And while he was singing, and I said, turn the camera on. And he turned the camera on to record him because then he would let us in, you see, easily without any fuss. He started singing, gunshots rang out outside. Bop, 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 bop. And he said, don't mind them, boys. And he started singing again, Mona Lisa, Mona Lisa. We ducked for cover thinking the gunshots would come pretty close to us. And we went in, and as soon as we got into the corridor, I said, we're going to use that as the beginning of our documentary report. Because 5 minutes later, people were carried in bleeding on stretchers and things because there was some gunfight outside the hospital.
Wow.
And when I told this story, Vidya started laughing or smirking and began to talk to me. And from then on, it's been a good 20-year run of friendship.
And what did his, as a writer and as a reviewer, what does his writing mean to you?
I think he's one of the most important writers of the 20th century. He was somebody who made a profession out of not being nationalistic. So in the post-colonial era, in our era, a lot of nationalisms have arisen. India gets its independence and India feels extremely proud of itself. It doesn't want to look at the truth of itself in any detailed or insightful form. They just, we say we're the biggest democracy in the world. What do we mean? Yes, there are more people there and they all have the ballot. They vote. But we don't vote for material self-interest. We vote by and large in vote banks. So in Britain, for instance, or in America, you'd have one person being a Republican and one person being a Democrat. In Britain, you'd have Boris Johnson for Brexit and his sister, Rachel Johnson, for remaining in the European Union, and his father, uh, whatever his name is, Stanley Johnson, for remaining in the. So you have families divided on what they see as their material or career interest. In India, you don't. You never find a divided family. Everybody would vote one way because they are the vote bank for that particular party. So there are flaws in nationalism. And there are other nationalisms that have arisen. For instance, with the fight in America for black recognition and, for black rights, for Afro-American rights, with the civil rights movement and then the militant Black Panther movement and so on, it began to be that fighting for rights turned into what you can say and what you can't say, what the truth is and what the truth isn't. And it leads to a kind of fear of a freedom of speech. So you can't, for instance, say, you can't quite openly say that 90% of the gunfights that happen on London's streets or in Manchester streets are perpetrated by black kids, by black young people. They say, well, that's stereotyping, There are other nationalisms like immigrant nationalism here. And if you say that the people who groom young, vulnerable girls in gangs are mostly Pakistanis from Mirpur, right? 90% of them are. Some may not be, some may join the gang from outside. You're not allowed to say that. That is, it's not right to say it. Vidya never had any nationalism. Not about Trinidad, not about the West Indies, not about Africa, not about India. His nationalism was literature. His nationalism was insight that writing should always, as he insisted, have. So he didn't mind about provoking and trying to tell the truth as he saw it. So in his first book on India, for instance, he wrote An Area of Darkness, it was called. And he called it the Area of Darkness because he found 50 things that he was surprised and shocked by, and which should not have belonged to a country he was ready to adulate. He turned there thinking, my great-grandfather comes from there, my grandfather came from there, and I want to know what this is about. And he saw a kind of disparity in its ways of thinking. He saw a kind of brushing under the carpet, things that were manifestly there. For instance, he said that Indians feel nothing about urinating and excreting in the streets and by the railway lines. He could have gone further and said that for thousands of years nobody built lavatories, and he could in fact have gone the nationalistic way and blamed the British for not building public lavatories, right? But he didn't go that far. He just said, I see this and I think something should be done about it. It's wrong.
So in that sense, was he a good, this was raised the other night, was he a good reporter?
He was a great reporter, and he turned all his reports into stories. He would make a narrative out of the people he interviewed, the things he saw, and he would tell it without any being fed any ideological bias. So, for instance, I would see the very right-wing, very nationalistic Maharashtrian party in the town where I grew up, Pune, as, pseudo-fascistic, right? Whereas he would go into the slum which they controlled and notice that they'd put up a medical dispensary, that they'd put up schools, that they'd given the people there, when he questioned them, what we call in Sanskrit Atma Vishwas, which means pride in one's own soul. So he would see that side of the party, which me and my leftist friends would call neo-fascistic.
So did he bring you a lot of comfort writing about India?
He made me feel at first, after his first book, that here is somebody who tells a necessary truth. You may think, right, that uh, criticizing or pointing out the ridiculousness of a nuclear scientist in charge of very large projects in India gets his daughter married by reading horoscopes, right? Uh, Horoscopes don't gel with Einsteinian science, you know, or with Heisenbergian science. It doesn't work. It's living in with two minds in the same world, which is very strange. Now, I would see that as something that ought to be remedied. He, as a visitor, criticized it, wrote about it, and left.
Was he? There was a comment also the other night that which I remember you disagree with, that someone likened that portrait of the colonial white man. And what did you think of that?
I don't think that he thought anything of being white or black or brown or Indian. It didn't occur to him that he wasn't white skinned or wanted to be any such thing. The fact about him was that he was looking at the world as he had received it from birth upwards. And that means reading books, listening to music, seeing institutions grow, seeing cruelty, backwardness, rule of law. He grew up and he admired, I suppose, Western civilization. And he wasn't alone in that. When I wrote a biography of C.L.R. James, a very eminent Trinidadian by birth, philosopher, Marxist in some senses, great cricket fan, novelist, very intelligent man. He lived with us for a while, with me, my house, and he himself would say that this back to Africa makes no sense. The back to Africa movement amongst black people in America or the Caribbean doesn't make any sense because we are now, as a result of slavery, as a result of the historical movement of people, enforced, cruel, however much it was, now we have become a part of Western civilization. And we must face the fact that that's who we are. We are part of Western civilization. And that means inheriting the books, the literature, the music, the institutions that the West has provided us with. And I think in that sense, Naipaul was a Western person. The derogatory term is a white person. He didn't think of white or brown.
How would you interpret, he said once, I believe that I never meant to hurt anyone. How would you interpret that in his writing?
I don't know that he didn't mean to hurt anyone. He definitely knew that the provocative things he said would actually get people angry. I don't know if they actually hurt anybody. If he says, for instance, Jane Austen is not a good writer, it's pure gossip, and nobody would admire her if she had been Croatian. It was because she lived at the height of British Empire in the beginning of the 19th century that she has been noticed by the world. Now, I don't understand. I can clearly see that millions of women, millions of readers would object to that statement and say that's nonsense. She's a great writer, whatever. Marvelous insights, a beginning of novels about relationships. Maybe they'd say all that. I don't see that it will hurt them. This pretense of hurt is, you're not abusing your mother, He wasn't beating up your daughter. He was just saying that this woman is not as great a writer as she's made out to be.
So do you
So
think,
disagreement but not hurt.
do you think in some ways that his provocation was just what you would say today is good marketing?
He always said that if writers don't provoke, they're not worth it, right? That when you start saying something important, you begin to divide the world. And that's absolutely true. In my essay, I've said that, think about it, if Galileo, right, divided the world in his time by saying that the earth did go around the sun, and the clerics who tried him for uh, blasphemy or sacrilege or whatever, for breaking the tenets of Christianity, said to him, no, you have to admit that the earth is stable if the sun goes round us. It's not true, right? At the end of his trial, I mean, he admitted that, okay, he said, if you say so, the earth stands still. But as he walked out of the court, he said, Epur si mueve, and yet it moves. So people who make statements like that do divide the world. You know, if somebody said the world is, when people thought the world was flat and somebody said it was round, they divided opinion. And I think Vidya, in his own severe way, did that to a lot of orthodoxies that people follow today.
Do you think he, I mean, it's probably maybe a bit personal, but do you think he suffered from depression?
Suffered from depression.
Was he a happy person?
He had melancholic moments. He was extremely depressed by things he saw. When we were in India together at certain times, I would say, I'm going down into so-and-so place. He said, I don't want to see it, you know. It depresses me. I don't want to see it. I shan't come. And so maybe Nadira and I would set out and go and see a place which he wanted to avoid. So there was that side to him. It was a sensitivity rather than a proclivity to depression.
That's quite interesting.
He hated seeing cruelty to animals. If I said to him, come and examine the abattoir, absolutely not. You know, that would be like asking him to visit Hades. He wouldn't have gone.
You told a lovely story, or you added to a lovely story the other night about women that wear the bindis. I thought that was very entertaining. Would it be alright to tell that again?
No.
And most importantly, you rounded it off talking about his idea on religion. I thought that was,
Yeah.
you know,
Vidya was brought up a Hindu. In other words, he didn't understand much about the religion at the time, but he was certainly introduced to its rituals through his mother's household. His mother was part of a very eminent Indian family of Trinidad. One of them his uncle became the prime minister at one point. And they had a very large place, which he characterizes in his novel as Hanuman House, right? And Hanuman, of course, is the primitive forest dweller god, as they call him, the monkey god of the Hindus. So he knew about the ritual of Hinduism, but didn't believe in its philosophy. He was atheistic, I think, to the last. And so he used to, being brought up in those rituals and not liking them and feeling that they were the product of ignorance, of superstition. He once said to somebody who asked him, what does the red caste mark? That's where it started. Nowadays, of course, it's just there for celebration or for decoration. He said, what does that caste mark in the middle of the forehead mean? And he said, it means I've got nothing in my head. And of course it was provocative. Of course it was an attempt at humor. But behind it was the idea that people who believe in ritual are stupid.
I really like that Why? Well, a couple of West Indies things here. Why? What did he mean that nothing was created in the West Indies?
I think what he meant was looking around, he didn't think that the West Indies, with all the history of cruelty, which is written so clearly about in a book called um, The Loss of El Dorado, right? It's a history of Trinidad. First of all, the wiping out of the native Caribbean people, then the slavery, then the indentured labor, right? The West Indies has not been a cradle of great civilization in its institutions, in its produce of anything that the world looks at as great inventions. I mean, of course, there's creativity there. He used to sing calypsos, right? And he appreciated calypsos. But you don't really equate calypsos with Beethoven. You can, and some people do, but I think it's a travesty of judgment to so do, you know.
I get the impression of someone who's not from Trinidad and speaking to people from there, I get the impression that they feel that he turned his back on that country, and they feel quite personal.
He absolutely did. He turned his back on the whole of the Caribbean. And for the reason that he said that these countries are not really countries, they're not viable. They've become so and separated into little states, you know. I mean, can you call Grenada a country? Can you call St. Kitts a country? They are small little, as C.L.R. James put it, pieces of dirt in the Caribbean Sea. And earlier on, there was, during the time of decolonization of this in the 60s, the agitation for decolonization in the Caribbean, there was a magnificent idea put forward that they should federate the whole of the West Indies, all the islands, including Cuba, right? And Bermuda, they ought to come together as one nation with one parliament, equal laws, and productivity, which would then go between the islands. And then possibly, they should have a pact with North America, with the United States of America, because that's where the labor goes and comes back. So he saw no great civilizing influence and said so. And I don't see why people should object to that.
But it wasn't that he was a displaced soul. I mean, was he happy in Britain?
I don't know if he was completely happy anywhere, you know. He liked some things about Britain. I disagreed with him on so many things. For instance, he would never venture to vote Labour. He would always vote Conservative, and he wouldn't even want to argue the Conservative case. He would just say, that's where I stand. And so we had pretty vociferous arguments because I am the opposite of Tory and even left of Labour, if you like. But he didn't mind me saying what I thought, but he wouldn't budge an inch in his own political opinions, allegiances.
There was one question I was looking for that I really liked, which was from my father, or from someone in Nairobi. I don't think I put it in. I think you kind of mentioned it anyway. But it's one thing from Gideon. He admitted that he despised noise. Was this a medical condition? Did he not like?
He
noise?
didn't what? Sorry.
He admitted once that he despised noise. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know the word means. What?
Noise.
Noise. I don't know that he ever said that to me. He didn't like a racket which would keep him awake, but he liked peace, of course. And I think so do we all. He didn't mind his flat never said anything about it in South Kensington in London, but in Wiltshire, he'd always point to the birds that came to the trees and so on and so forth. He didn't like anybody being cruel to animals. He just could not stand it. He heard once that in a village, the neighbors had used a horse, and then when it got old, they'd sent it off to the knacker's yard to be killed. And he couldn't stand that. He repeated that story to me day after day and said, how could they do that? It was their animal, it was part of their family. But they'd callously sent the animal off to be slaughtered. He couldn't take that. He didn't eat meat, for instance. And he had a cat, which I bought for him on his birthday and took it from Battersea Dogs Home in a cat box in my open car to Wiltshire and gave it to him. It was only a little kitten. And at first he just looked at it. He grew, it became his son. And he called it Augustus after a Roman emperor.
Did he ever talk about any regrets of not having children?
About not having children. He adopted, now there are 2 kids, formally, and of course was very fond of the grandchildren, right? Who are today 5, 6, I think, approximately. And he would play with them. He'd play all day with them. He didn't regret not having children. He said once to me, I wouldn't have known what to do with them. My books are my children. So, okay, you brought up your books. Let's see.
What were some of your favourite books of his, or some of his favourite writing? I mean, was there a certain period that you liked the most, or?
I thought his books about societies were very sharp. One of the best books on India, the best book on India is India, A Million Mutinies Now. He was observing the growth of India through the stories of different people. Yeah, that's one. Others, which are not much noticed by people, there's a book called Away in the World. It's part fiction, it's part history, it's part observation. It's quite a remarkable form of a book. Some might call it formless, but it's one of my favorites. A Bend in the River is a very powerful novel. I've adopted it as a screenplay, but it hasn't been adapted it as a screenplay. It hasn't been done yet, but soon will be, I hope. Then A Writer's People is again one of my favorites. So a mixture of fiction and non-fiction.
Very good. What will you miss about his friendship? He was obviously a very good friend.
Yes, his humor, his insight, his ability to listen to you and to pass judgments about your conversations on politics or on, and he wasn't never snappy about it, you know. If we were discussing William Wordsworth's poems, he'd wait for you to deliver some kind of judgment and he'd think it over and he'd comment on that. And that was very valuable because it kept I should say I had the most civilized conversations I've ever had with anybody, with him.
There was something that was mentioned the other night as well. Would you mind talking please about the autobiography that was written by Patrick French? And there's a particular moment when he rang you,
Yes.
and I believe you were in Australia.
Yes.
Would you mind telling us about that?
No, I'll tell you. Patrick French was chosen by Nadira and Vidya to do his biography. Patrick had written some books on India and so on, but he'd written one biography of a British Raj figure called Young Husband, right? And Vidya had read that biography and thought that was quite thorough. Now, that's a historical biography. And what he'd do with a living writer, uh, not a member of the Raj, I didn't know. But I think he and his agent and Nadira got together and said, yes, Patrick French should be allowed to do my biography. And when I asked him, who's this chap? And he said, oh, he's written a biography of a young husband, which is very good. So I don't know who came up with the idea, whether Patrick did, or whether the agent did, or whether the publishing house did. But Patrick got the authorized biography permission. In other words, Vidya, I don't know if he signed on any dotted line, but he agreed contractually to allow Patrick to explore his life. Now, Patrick used to come to the house. I've shared several weekends or days there with Patrick being there. And Vidya would go into a room with Patrick, and we could walk in and out, and he'd tell him all sorts of things, you know. And once I had to ask Vidya, why are you telling him about your interaction with prostitutes and what you felt after? He said, because the truth must be known. You know, I did this. And I remember he wept once and said he'd betrayed his first wife, Pat, by going to prostitutes and lying about it. And after he'd interacted with the prostitute or done his stuff, he regretted it. He would feel a great sense of shame, you know, at having paid for sex or whatever. I don't know. But he talked to Patrick extensively about those things, showed him all the letters, and gave him free rein to look at the letters in his collection, which is at an American university. So Patrick was quite intimate and a friend. And I remember once we went to Aix in France for a sort of literary festival celebrating VS's work. Patrick came with us. He brought his children. He brought his then wife and children, and he was getting on with writing it. One episode I remember was while I was here, Nadira and Gillen Aitken, the agent, went across to the publishers and said, look, we've read the proofs of this, and you're talking about us, about Nadira, and about Gillen in unflattering terms, and we want those sentences excised from the work. And we haven't authorized you, right? Vidya may have, so you can say what you like about Vidya, but you can't say that about these things about us. So they did cut those things out. I got that, and I put it down to a kind of a looseness of style, right? I was in Australia. I had gone there for some work. I was in a hotel in Brisbane, and late at night, my hotel room phone rings. Pick it up. It's Nadira. He said, where are you? I said, well, you found my hotel room in Lisbon, so you know exactly where I am. And she said, yes, why aren't you here? I said, why should I be there? I'm working here. She said, he wants to speak to you. I said, okay, what's happened? You know, I thought something serious. And he came on and he said, Patrick French has betrayed us, you know. So I said, what do you mean? And he said he's put in all sorts of things told to him by third parties, which he didn't check with me, about beating women and buggering women and so forth. And he said, I don't do that. It's not something that I plead guilty to. And, you know, so he really has betrayed us, he said. So I said, but Patrick was a friend. Why has he done that? Long silence. And then Vidya says, Farrukh, you don't realize how deep socialism has gone. And I've never understood that statement. But when he, later on, when he objected to anybody saying these gardeners are messing up with the garden and doing something, and I tell him, used to tell him, Vidya, you don't realize how deep socialism has gone. And he would laugh. He would laugh because he didn't say it as a joke, but he realized what I was doing. And I read Patrick French's biography. It's very detailed. It goes into a lot of aspects. I think it's quite well written. But there is a lack of a dimensional lack of appreciation, which I can only say it's like asking a non-mathematician to write Einstein's biography. It works, but on a level.
Right. It seems that a lot of people seem to have picked up on all that other stuff, which maybe is
Yes, they did.
too many, maybe, which is not.
They all said he abused women and buggered them and so forth.
Yeah.
And I've never known Vidya to either tell or tolerate lies, right? Honestly, even white lies. No, that's not true. It happened this way and that. He was like, so I wouldn't think if he denied the fact, I wouldn't think it was untrue. So, but that's all. That's a judgment, not a fact.
He was, I've got here, the 6th British writer to won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he claims that no one in Britain recognised this achievement. Is that true?
I don't know that they didn't, I never thought it was, he won the Booker Prize. He got a knighthood, for God's sake, The problem was that even when the BBC, even when he got the Nobel Prize, the BBC didn't do him, didn't sing a paean of praise. They called in some Muslim fellow who attacked him into the studio and so on. So there was a lot of sniping going on, and he didn't appreciate that, obviously.
Where were you when he won the prize?
I'll tell you a story. I was in Bangalore in India. I was working there at an animation television film firm. And I got a phone call on my mobile which said, Mr. Dhondy, do you have a landline? I said, who's this? He said, this is the BBC. I said, what do you want a landline? He said, we want to speak to you on The World at 1. And that's an important program. So I said, what about? And they said, about your friend V.S. Naipaul. So I said, my God, is he? He said, no, he's not dead. He's just won the Nobel Prize. I said, oh, fantastic. And I said, yeah, that's my landline. Call me at 1, British time. And it was afternoon there. It was 5 o'clock or something there. And I said, I immediately called Lady Naipaul, called the house. Nazira answered and said, Farrukh, the place has gone mad. You should have been here. There are crews from all over the world camped in the village, and they are being given timetables by me to speak to him. And he's just now talking to ITV. But if he knows you're on the phone, he'll come and speak to you. He knows you're in India. He asked after you. I said, okay, I'll hang on. I said, I'll call later. No, hang on. And he comes to the phone and says, hello, Farrukh, hello. You've heard of my little piece of good luck. Which was very modest of him. And I knew that side of him too. He was modest, he was funny, he was provocative, he was nasty to people. He walked out of a dinner party once with me. He told the hostess, you're talking absolute nonsense, I can't take this anymore, I'm going.
Sounds like he was very honest.
But she was talking platitudes, she wasn't talking nonsense, And she invited us to dinner.
In the interview you did with him in Wiltshire, he talked quite candidly about British writers and having not lived or experienced the environment they lived in, particularly Jane Austen.
Yes.
Which you mentioned earlier. Is this because he set the bar extremely high as a writer?
He wanted writing to do very particular things. He loved the early Dickens. He loved Shakespeare. He loved Maupassant. Yeah. Uh, he read the essays of Montaigne. This sort of thing. He had very particular tastes. In poetry, he didn't like T.S. Eliot, though we read it repeatedly. He enjoyed some of Tennyson and would ask me to read it. He'd ask me to read Shakespeare's sonnets to him and think about it. Wordsworth, he loved bits of Wordsworth. He was very severe about some writers. Henry James, unreadable. James Joyce, I don't read blind writers. E.M. Forster, he went to India to bugger little boys. That's what he said. William Faulkner, unreadable. Thomas Hardy, not really my thing. So,
You sound like quite a character.
Rudyard Kipling, yes. Insightful, great short stories, he appreciated that.
What was the spat over with Paul Theroux? What was that all about?
Oh God, I can tell you the inside story of that.
I mean, if you want to, or if you don't.
Yeah, no, what happened was Paul Theroux knew Vidya's first wife, Pat, quite well. And Pat died, and Nadira was in the house in Wiltshire, and she saw books there which Theroux had signed to Pat and Vidya, with my love and thinking of good times and so forth, whatever he'd written. Nadira didn't want to see those books day after day. So she went and donated them, gave them, sold them to a Salisbury second-hand bookshop. The Salisbury fellow realized that these were precious objects signed by an international writer to another international writer and his wife. And so he, I think, must have put them on the web for sale or sold them to book collectors in New York or America. At which point Paul Theroux got to know through acquaintances, friends, that his books were being sold, the books that he'd given to Vidya were being sold. So he wrote a very nasty letter to, I don't know if it was very nasty, but he wrote something to Vidya. And Nadira replied, and then there was a correspondence between them, and a long correspondence, which then Paul Theroux ridiculed and said, look what this person has written to me. And Nadira got angry with that and came to me and said, what do you think? And I said, you don't reply at length. The English way of doing it is you find two sentences which are biting and you send him an email or a fax saying those. And she said, well, invent those sentences, which I did. And we faxed them to him, and he was extremely angry. And he wrote a book called Sir Vidya's Shadow, right? And that was a kind of expose of Vidya insofar as how they had interacted in Africa when they were there together, in Tanzania, I believe.
Oh, wow.
They were both there, and Paul Theroux was a disciple of Vidya, but then Vidya was very contemptuous, and he listed all the ways in which Vidya could be not popular, and he called that in Vidya's Shadow. Then years later, he came up and said hello and said, I missed you. And Vidya said, I missed you too. And they became friends. And when we were at the Jaipur festival, I was chairing the meeting, but Hanif Qureshi and Paul Theroux were speaking about Vidya's on the 50th or so anniversary of A House for Mr. Biswas. They were speaking about his book,
Oh, wow.
and they were friends from then on.
Oh, what a great story. Thanks for telling us.
Yeah, that's it.
I hope he puts this on radio. He should do, because it's a lot of information there. Not long to go. Just a couple of questions on his family, I suppose. Did he ever talk about his father?
He talked a lot about his father. He was very respectful of his father, and he said he had good short stories and so forth. But somebody published a correspondence between his father and himself, and they asked him about it, and he said, I have nothing to do with it. I don't want to comment on this. It's not one of my books. It's something I wrote to my father. It perhaps should have stayed private. But I've got a copy of it, and it's quite moving between father and son. They were close. His sisters, he liked the older sister who grew up with him. But the others, right, the other sisters, he was estranged from them by and large. And I've got a book by his younger sister there. And she doesn't treat, I think she's honest about it. She says Vidya came to Trinidad and didn't quite fit into the family as such. There was some alienation. He didn't treat the rest of the family as though they were his intimate family.
There's something here that says Savi Akal, I'm not sure
Yes.
the pronunciation, wrote in her book, among other things, that
Yes.
his father, C. Prasad,
Yeah.
would have been disappointed that Savidya married a divorced Muslim woman so quickly after the death of his wife, Patel. What do you think? I mean,
I never knew C. Prasad, but it may have been that, he was of that. And the sister knew the father very well because lived with him all his life.
Right. Thank you. Great. And last few questions now.
Tell me.
A Trinidadian medical professor, Paul Theroux, said, my Paul was a deeply wounded man who had but few joys, but if he hadn't suffered, he may not have been propelled to produce. His life is what it has been. Any thoughts?
I don't know whether any form of psychology explains a person's genius. It may explain his animus. It may explain what he wants to do and why he wants to write. So somebody who's been abused in childhood, sexually abused, shall we say, might produce a particular kind of literature in later life. I don't know what that would be, or whether it would be about sexual abuse at all. It might be, writing horror stories, or dream sequences. I don't know, but I don't think that any psychology affected, if you could call it that, affected the way Vidya looked. I think being born in Trinidad, from a very small island, from a place which he could judge had not the sort of civilization that the West had, or had inherited through history, I think that influenced him. And that influenced the way he looked at things, ways of seeing. And when he went to Africa, that's the kind of standard he employed. If somebody would tell him some superstitious thing, in one of his books, somebody tells him, we are sitting at this dinner party, but I'm actually two people. Part of me is in France and part of me is here. He would know that that was rubbish, and that was some voodoo that this person had in his head. And it was not amenable to common sense or to rational thought.
I have a question here. Because of his dual personality, psychologists are comparing Savidya with greats such as Mozart, Bill Gates, Einstein, Churchill, Chairman Mao, and so on. What do you think of that?
I don't know that any of those figures had dual personalities, that they made a difference to the world, yes. That Vidya has made a difference to the world in our times, he certainly has, right? He has a divided opinion. He has written incisively in a particular era. Who knows whether the contribution that he has made to literature will last as long as Einstein's contribution to physics or Mozart's contribution to music. One doesn't know.
Do you think it'll be read in 100 years?
Who knows? I really can't say. But certainly, if anybody wants to know the truth of a transitional era, his books will be valuable.
Perfect. I think that's covered. So
Good.
thank you. Was Vidya harsh on Muslims? Would you say? Was he mean?
He had two major things, very big things, to say about Muslims in our time. I don't think he thought one way or the other about Islam or about the religion or about the Prophet or any such thing. The first thing he said about Islam was its impact on India. He said that the Muslim conquests of India, which started in the 12th century or earlier, there were parts of India taken over in the 8th, 9th century. There were raids into India. They said the Muslim civilization or the Muslim conquests wiped out a lot of Hindu civilization. He said that the Brahminical civilization of India had been suppressed and wounded by Muslim conquest. And there's absolutely no doubt that that is true. But one could, of course, say that other conquests in other places had the same kind of effect on civilization. You could say that the Native Americans were wiped out by European invasion. And in a very different way, the Muslims came, they settled in India, they ruled India, and they converted the lower castes because Islam doesn't have a caste system. So they brought that positiveness to India in terms that I would respect, right? I don't believe that humans should be classified for life in castes. Some people do, but I don't. And therefore, I think it's a benefit that Islam brought to India. But Vidya wouldn't have seen that. He looked at it and said, they destroyed Brahminical civilization. They destroyed the ways of life, the texts, the this and that, and the temples. Now, that was one thing that he thought was a corrective to the history during the independence movements. In the independence movement, it was axiomatic to say that Hindus, Muslims, Christians, we all are together as Indians fighting the British to get them out, right? And of course that was true at the time. There was no big fight because it was by and large a non-violent Gandhian protest, which the British respected. But they kept Hindus and Muslims together by not harping on the nastier parts of Muslim history in India. Vidya said this was false, it was hiding the truth, and we need to expose it. So he went about trying to do that, or at least attacking the historians who didn't do it. So that was one aspect. The second aspect was he set out in the days of resurgent Islam in our times, he set out to look at what he called the converted countries. And the basis, the assumption with which he started seems to be true, that countries which have been conquered by Islam deny their previous history. So Persia, for instance, right? People start from 643 or whenever it was, 643, I think, the invasion of Persia by the Arabs. And before that, there was a glorious prehistoric and historic civilization of Zoroastrianism in Persia, but it was wiped out. You know, there are historical monuments, again, neglected, but thousands of years of history gave way to the Islamic civilization which was imported from the Arabs. Also in India, right, a place like Pakistan, their history books begin with the invasion of the Arabs into Sindh. There were thousands of years of Hinduism, Buddhism, right, and prehistoric civilizations like the Indus Valley civilization, which the Pakistanis don't acknowledge as their own. Islam begins their history. And he says when that happens, you get to one book which tells the story of the people, and you don't get to an appreciation of the very broad civilizations that existed before. So he writes about the converted people in 4 or 5 countries. And of course, that's got him into deep trouble and criticism of being anti-Islamic. It's unjust to say that he's anti-Islamic. What he's saying is that the religion converted these people, wiped out their earlier civilizations, and that it has given rise to a lot of cruel practices, such as the Iranian Revolution. You know.
One question just for myself: why have people been so quick to sort of, I don't know, demonize this man?
Because we live in an era of black nationalism, feministic nationalism, African nationalisms, you know. And when he became an Islamic nationalism, if you like, and if he gets critical about any of these and says this exists or that exists, so this is what I see, they don't like it. That's basically, I think, his quarrel with the world.